From South Carolina Public Radio, this is Walter Edgar's Journal. This week, we are bringing you another episode in our occasional series which explores South Carolina from A to Z in depth.
South Carolina from A to Z is our sister podcast, also broadcast each weekday on South Carolina Public Radio. It brings you bite-sized, one-minute topics from the South Carolina Encyclopedia.
Today, we have selected 5 of those topics to explore in depth. As you and I record the A's to Z's, you are a taskmaster, 145 to 448 words, no more.
I crack the whip.
And some of these folks or these incidents have interesting backstories.
Yep.
And so I just picked out about 3 or 4 of them today. You know, we're already into the 250th observance of the American Revolution.
Right.
And one of the more interesting battles in South Carolina, and we have lots of them, you know, more than anybody else.
That's true. A lot of people don't realize that.
And everybody knows about Kings Mountain and Cowpens and others. But there was a Battle of Hanging Rock in August 1780. And to set the stage, Charleston had surrendered in May, and the British were trying to take over. They did, you know, South Carolina was now back in the empire. It was the only colony that was actually occupied permanently by the enemy.
Again, something that folks don't always know. I mean, they know that the Brits occupied some cities in New England, but they occupied all of South Carolina.
All of South Carolina. It was a military occupation. Civilian government was never restored in South Carolina during the British occupation. And the British were moving into the backcountry at a place called Hanging Rock. It was one of the several outposts that the British established to try to protect the landline to their main post at Camden, South Carolina.
Okay.
Colonel Thomas Sumter, you know, the old gamecock, decided, well, we got to get rid of this place. This is his turf. And so on August the 6th, 1780, they made a concentrated line blow right at the British line. This is a little bit different from Marion, you know, hit and run.
Right.
He's actually launching an attack on the British outposts. And the Americans' rifle fire obliterated one British regiment. Our friend Boyd Saunders, the artist, has done a painting of the Battle of Hanging Rock. And one of the things that stands out in that painting, and which was true, is you see Catawba warriors. The Catawba Indians fought on the side of the American rebels during the American Revolution.
Right.
And they were very much a part of the attack at Hanging Rock. Eventually, the enemy rallied, and the Americans, because they didn't have a lot of equipment, stopped to take what they could from the British camp. But it was a significant setback for the British forces in the backcountry. Just one of many that happened between the fall of Charleston and Kings Mountain. It showed to the British command, you don't really control the backcountry like you think. And it showed to potential loyalists joining Tory regiments that maybe you better think twice before making that decision.
And I laugh because, as you and I know, and we've discussed before, sometimes with guests on this show, the South Carolina backcountry, once it got riled up, came at the British in ways they did not anticipate and with a ferocity that they did not think would happen. As a matter of fact, didn't they think that the backcountry was going to side with them?
Well, yeah, the backcountry hadn't been too happy about the revolution when it got started.
Right. They weren't really into it.
Well, 2/3 of the white population lived in the backcountry. They had little or no representation in the Commons House of Assembly.
Nope.
And they would talk to those folks in Charleston, you're talking about no representative government from England 2,000 miles away. We're 150 miles away, and we don't have representative government here.
Yep.
But once the British moved into the backcountry and began messing with folks, it was a mixed population. There were Scots-Irish,
Sure.
English, some Germans, although the Germans tended to be loyalists.
Right.
But anyway, they really riled up those Scots-Irish and made the life for the British Army of Occupation hell on earth.
Okay. Well, and again, you think about battles in the southern part of the colonies during the American Revolution. The Battle of Hanging Rock doesn't necessarily come to mind, but it should be noted.
It should be noted because, again, it's just a little over 6 weeks after the British have taken over Charleston, and they think South Carolina is theirs.
It's done.
It's done. Big mistake.
All right. So there you go. H is for Hanging Rock, Battle of August 6th, 1780. So heading through the alphabet, we're going to go for B is for Barrier Islands. And South Carolina and North Carolina, and on down a little bit into Florida, we have barrier islands.
And Georgia.
And Georgia, some of which are very well known as vacation spots from folks across the country.
Yeah. But all barrier islands are not the same.
Right.
There are two types, at least on the Carolina coast. There are barrier islands that are erosion remnant islands, and there are some of them began as sandbars because, as you know, the ocean is not all that deep right along the Carolina coast.
Right.
And wave action builds up the dune ridges, and eventually they might become an island. And then, of course, once you've got some land, the birds drop seeds, you've got sea oats coming up, you've got maritime foliage of one kind or another. And unlike the more stable barrier islands, these islands that have been created from sandbars, they're not all that stable. They're dynamic. Just think about how much renourishment we do along our coast on some of these islands.
Right.
One end of an island loses sand and it builds up
right
on the southern end.
And am I not correct in saying that a number of the islands that are used for recreation along the South Carolina coast are the sandbar islands?
Yeah.
Right.
I mean, there are others like Edisto, which are real islands.
In other words, the product of erosion.
Yeah. But it's one of those things, it's a constantly changing landscape, but folks in the 21st century, they don't want it to change,
It's a living, flowing system.
Yeah.
And we build what we think are permanent structures on some of the islands that are, again, the erosion remnant islands perhaps tending to be more stable, but we build on what's there, and we like this island, and it's a sandbar island, and it is not as stable as the erosion remnant islands.
And it's something you will find discussed every year as it doesn't take a hurricane. We can have just get a brush with some high tides and
right.
There went so many feet of front beach.
Yeah. I went to one of the coastal islands, and I won't begin to theorize whether it was a sandbar island or not, but I do know that when we went to the beach, this wasn't Hunting Island, but it was down that way. We walked to the beach, and there was a house on stilts. Good idea on the coast. But it was on the beach. I don't mean it was up in the dunes behind the beach. It was on the beach. When it was built, it wasn't built in the water. It wasn't built where high tide would surround it. But in this case, high tide surrounded that old house every time. Obviously abandoned. Yeah. But again, a case of a fluid, dynamic system and somebody trying to put a structure on it and call it done.
Well, you mentioned Hunting Island State Park, and that has suffered tremendous erosion in recent times.
Okay. Well, B is for barrier islands. Let's move on with some more B's. Now, we're talking about the coast, and we're talking about islands. Let's move back into the 17th and early 18th century. We're talking about pirates.
Oh, man, you get one of my favorite topics. The basis for this is Stede Bonnet. Bonnet was a native of Barbados. Of course, that's the South Carolina connection, but he became a pirate, plundering ships from New York to Charleston. He actually worked with Blackbeard at one time. Everybody knows about Blackbeard, the guy who put little candles in his beard to...
Right, yeah.
I've never understood that was not a very smart thing to do, but anyway. Bonnet was actually captured in 1718 by some South Carolinians and brought into Charleston, and he and his crew were tried, convicted, and hanged for piracy. But I really want to use Bonnet as a jumping point for pirates
in general
and South Carolina, because pirates were operating out of the Caribbean, and you need to remember that South Carolina is a child of the Caribbean. There are trade ties, personal ties, and in the first 50 years of its existence, when it was still a proprietary colony, pirates were a very important part of the local economy. They had hard currency. So they would come to Charleston, they would buy foodstuffs, they would fence stolen goods, and more than one colonial governor had his hand out and didn't deal with the pirates too well. But in terms of the general history of South Carolina and the British Empire and pirates, Daniel Defoe, everybody knows his most famous work, right? Robinson Crusoe.
Right.
But he also wrote a history of the pirates.
He did, okay.
Yes. And he also was involved in writing political tracts for various South Carolina political factions. So he was very familiar. When he talked about the history of the pirates, he's talking about South Carolina. And it was not considered bad to have any association with the pirates. It's only when they finally overstepped their bounds and they began to raid the ships as they leave Charleston Harbor. That's what Bonnet started doing, and that's when South Carolina said, we've had enough of this stuff.
Right. And it was 1718 in May, they blockaded Charleston. And that's how they were able, so then if you were going in or out, you had to get past them.
Yes. And one of the things they did is they would seize hostages for ransom.
This is a familiar thing to people of the 20th and 21st century, not off our coast, but off other coasts, where we have had some very famous instances of pirates seizing ships.
What is interesting about Bonnet himself, you usually think of pirates as being ne'er-do-wells and outlaws and what have you.
Yeah, I was going to ask you about this, because he wasn't.
No, he was a member of the island's planter elite. And if you were a member of the planter elite in Barbados, you had lots of money.
Money and social position?
Yeah. But for some reason, he purchased a sloop, a relatively small ship, and decided he wanted to be a pirate. Arg!
and you sort of wonder about Mr. and Mrs. Bonnet looking on young Steed and going, kids. I mean, what possessed him? Who knows? Nobody knows. It's nothing written in the record as to why.
No.
Okay. But there he goes.
But the battle that resulted in his capture in September 1718 was 6 hours. South Carolina had actually created a little naval force, and obviously not with huge ships.
Right.
But they had found him off the coast of North Carolina, and then they captured him, as I said, brought him back, and he and 33 of his crew were tried and convicted and hanged by the neck until they were dead.
And that's kind of remarkable if you stop and think about it, because remember, British colonies, there is no South Carolina Navy, there is no Virginia Navy. So from scratch, they pulled together a small navy and go after them and win.
And next time you go to Charleston and you're walking in White Point Gardens, there on the Battery, that's where they were all hanged, was on White Point Garden. The gallows went up.
A relaxing stroll in the killing grounds. Okay, well, B is for Bonnet Steed, 1688 to 1718, a pirate. And we'll move on now. Again, for those of you who have been here before, you'll know that this all comes from the South Carolina Encyclopedia, and my good friend Walter Edgar here, who's the managing editor of that volume, takes the articles each week and comes up with 5 different topics or people that we need to know more about, it's broadcast on South Carolina Public Radio. But it's also podcast. So if you want to hear more of this kind of stuff, in a 1-minute format, you can always find us, South Carolina from A to Z, wherever you get your podcasts.
1 minute and 145 words is the only thing that Alfred gives me. That's why we're having this conversation today.
I'm a mean man.
He is very mean about that.
So C is for Colleton, Sir John, 1608 to 1666. I often look at the dates for a lot of the people that we look at, particularly in the 17th and 18th century, and realize that I have lived long past the years of many of these people. At age 70, I've lived a longer life than many of them did. If you stop and think about that, the conditions in which they lived, there was a lot in the world, particularly in the American colonies, which could kill you.
Well, you had to worry about Native Americans.
Mm-hmm.
You had to worry about disease.
Yes.
And there was always the threat of invasion from Spanish Florida.
Right. Charleston was, or eventually became, of course, a big city. But there you are, just the sanitation on the peninsula and the way food was handled. I mean, I don't think I would have wanted to eat meat in the 17th century at all.
That's why they had spices, Alfred.
Right, to make it not taste bad. 1608 to 1666. Anyway, he was born in England.
He was born in England. He had been a supporter of King Charles I, who, of course, lost his head.
I don't think he lost it. I think they took it. Anyway.
Yeah. He and his family fled to Barbados. Now, see, we're beginning to get what would become a South Carolina connection there.
Right.
When Charles II gained the throne, Colleton returned back to England, and he was immediately knighted by the king, which tells us he was doing something to help Charles II get the crown.
Mm-hmm.
And he became the leader of the group of what we would call the Lord Proprietors of South Carolina.
Right.
They would get this huge land grant that went from basically the Virginia state line to the St. Johns River and from the Atlantic to the Pacific. And basically the king owed this group of men money because they'd been financing his successful retaking of the crown. And so they accepted this land grant of 850,000 square miles as settlement of the debts that Charles II owed to them. Under Sir John's direction, the group set out to recruit settlers.
Mm-hmm.
And one of the places they went was the Caribbean islands of Barbados.
Right.
They recruited people from New England. People forget that we had Puritans who came to South Carolina. They eventually...
Yeah, I'd forgotten that too.
Well, Dorchester.
Yeah, okay.
Dorchester. Yeah. From Dorchester, that congregation had started out in Dorchester, England,
yeah.
Dorchester, Massachusetts, and it ended up in Dorchester, South Carolina.
Cool.
And then those Puritans found out they weren't really happy here, so they moved down into Georgia.
Okay.
So, but Colleton was the lead character in thinking about settling South Carolina. He died before the first permanent settlers got here, but he was the driving force behind this proprietary colony, this huge land grant. I love to see it on the map. I mean,
I've seen those maps, yeah.
When I would talk to friends who are big into sports about the Southeastern Conference, I would say, hey, the Lord's Proprietors covered all of that territory, including Texas and Southern California. So, anyway, but
Southern California.
And of course, we do have a Colleton County in South Carolina.
Yeah, we do.
Which was named for him and his descendants.
Okay. Well, C is for Colleton, Sir John, 1608 to 1666. Now, we were going to move next in the alphabet to the letter S, but I want to skip to W because I want to finish up with the letter S. And W is for Woodmason Charles. 1720 is when he was born, we think.
Yeah.
And are we not sure of the date of his death?
We're not sure when he died because he left South Carolina in 1773 and then returned to England.
Mm-hmm.
He was a clergyman. He didn't start out that way. He was in Charleston in the 1750s, lived kind of in the back country, but then in Charleston, he operated a bookshop.
Oh, okay.
And then he decided, he got a call to the ministry, and he went to England and was ordained an Anglican priest, and he was sent back here to work in St. Mark's Parish, which was the back country.
Okay.
On the frontier. Now, he was an Englishman and something of a snob.
Oh.
He kept a diary, a journal, which was published later in England, and he referred to himself as an itinerant minister in South Carolina. And it's fascinating.
Mm-hmm.
He talks about what people ate, how the cabins were built. He was an Anglican, but he's kind of a Puritan. Oh my gosh, those women, they put their clothes on and they tie things to show off their body shape. It's shameful. And
he looked with disdain upon the people he was ministering to. That's not a good idea.
He obviously showed, because at one point he was preaching, somebody let in about 30 or 40 dogs, and he counted them all.
Mm-hmm.
And then he announced to the local Presbyterian clergyman that he had just converted 40 of his parishioners.
They let the dogs into his church?
Yes.
Wow.
So, anyway,
woof.
He's one of those folks. People use that diary all the time because people would come to Charleston and talk about Charleston. Not many people lived in the backcountry and talked about what were they really eating, what
mm-hmm.
were they wearing, what did the cabins look like.
Now, as a historian, the written word is the history that we look to, the letters, the diaries, the contracts, things like that tell us about life in these times. He had this diary talking about his ministry in the backcountry of South Carolina with people he was not necessarily, he felt superior to in many ways.
Absolutely. I mean, he was an Englishman.
To borrow a term from creative writing, would you consider him a reliable narrator when it comes to describing the things he saw and did? I mean, he could describe a cabin, obviously.
Well, no, actually, because he was disdainful. Most people take his description, for example, of dress, food, as that's what it was,
mm-hmm.
because it was so different from what he expected and what he was used to.
It was remarkable.
It was remarkable. Now, poor guy, he had some issues at some point. We're not sure whether it happened in England or whether it happened when he first came out to South Carolina. He fell off a horse, and the horse kicked him in a place that boys don't like to talk about.
Okay.
And he would not have been able to function in his marital state, as he said.
Mm-hmm.
So he kind of had a sour look on life.
He was not a happy person.
He was not a happy person.
Okay. But still a valuable resource for historians looking to understand the mid-18th century in South Carolina. Okay, well, South Carolina from A to Z expanded on Walter Edgar's journal. We'll move to our final entry. And first of all, I'd like to say Robert Smalls has such an interesting and powerful story, particularly if you follow it from where we first start to hear about him, which is, of course, during the Civil War, but onward into Reconstruction. A remarkable man. But I have to tell you, I was looking at some social media the other day. I think it was on Facebook, and I get clips here and there that show up, various things from television shows. And there, I scrolled past and I went, "Wait a minute, that's Congressman James Clyburn from South Carolina. He's on the Stephen Colbert show, so I've got to listen to this." Colbert, of course, from South Carolina, and Clyburn tells the story like a good storyteller. He warms to the audience, and he tells the story of how this enslaved person escapes slavery with a ship, a boat at least, from Charleston Harbor during the Civil War. Let's talk about this guy.
Smalls was born into slavery, 1839,
mm-hmm.
and he was hired out by his owner, which was not uncommon.
Right.
as a laborer in Charleston where he worked on coastal vessels. We're not talking about big ships, but coastal commerce, smaller vessels.
Mm-hmm.
And at the start of the Civil War, he was the pilot on a steamer that brought cotton to the port of Charleston.
Mm-hmm.
Interestingly, the ship was called the Planter.
Right.
And it was impressed by the Confederate government into government service in the harbor as part of not so much the defenses, but keep an eye on what's going on. And in May 1862, he led to the takeover of the Planter by its crew of enslaved people. He also had on board his family.
He made sure of that.
He made sure his family was there. And very brazenly, they sailed past the port's harbor defenses,
Mm-hmm.
and he surrendered to the federal fleet blockading Charleston. Now, he timed it, and he was wearing a cap. He looked like the captain.
Right.
And nobody questioned what was going on.
Now, listening, I have to tell you, I think Congressman Clyburn's a pretty good storyteller, listening to him tell the story on Stephen Colbert. And he was talking about the fact that because this man, Robert Smalls, was familiar with the procedure of getting in and out of the harbor to travel up and down the coast, working under the captain, he paid attention to things like signals. What kind of signals was he going to give the people at Fort Sumter as they passed by with his whistle?
Mm-hmm.
I believe he may have even waved at them as they went by, something that the captain would normally do. I'm absolutely blown away by the courage and the boldness of this plot. It just, to me, is absolutely remarkable that he did this. But they make it. They escape. What happens then?
Then they get to the federal blockading force.
Right.
They end up in the Sea Islands.
Mm-hmm.
Beaufort now, remember, is occupied by federal forces.
Yes.
And the Planter is now part of the Union Navy.
Good deal.
And he is the captain. And when the war is over and South Carolina has a new constitution in 1868,
mm-hmm.
he is elected to the state legislature, member of the House of Representatives,
mm-hmm.
And then to the state Senate, and for a brief period, intermittently representing the Beaufort district in the U.S. Congress.
Wow.
He continued in public life until the state wrote a new constitution in 1895 that basically disenfranchised African Americans.
Mm-hmm.
He was one of 6 African American members of the state constitutional convention. He constantly lobbied for public education.
Yeah, that was one thing that Congressman Clyburn mentioned. South Carolina, did we not have the first, if not one of the first, requirements for public education for all?
Well, yes, the Constitution of 1868 said the state should supply public education. That's what they said.
Right. They didn't say how, but they set that goal, that standard.
They set that goal in the Constitution of 1868.
Mm-hmm.
And in some areas, particularly the Beaufort area, yes, they did have education for everybody. The Beaufort population was, I can't remember right off the top of my head, but it was at least 75 to 80% African American.
Mm-hmm.
And with the 1895 Constitution, they were taken out of the political equation in South Carolina.
Yeah.
Voting restrictions and the like. And
mm-hmm.
the state's constitutional convention, of course, came after Plessy versus Ferguson, where segregation's okay. And
it was that where we get the idea of, for instance, you can segregate as long as
it's equal. Yeah.
It's equal provision for both races.
Well, in discussion of voting rights and what have you, they would, and they were not the only people. There were some, the black members were not the only ones who were worried about voting requirements.
Mm-hmm.
And they would say anybody talk about free elections, and those who were Tillmanites who were pushing it said, we're not worried about free elections. We'd lose any free election if things weren't rigged. And the debates from the convention were published, and the passion and the openness of those 6 black men, but particularly Smalls, folks may not have liked it, but they listened to a point, but then, they're not going to do that.
Right. Right.
Uh,
It was impossible not to hear it because of the passion and I would assume, the intellect behind what they were saying.
Yes.
The
Yes.
facts.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And, of course, one of the most interesting things to come out of the 1895 State Constitutional Convention is, for the first time, race was defined in South Carolina.
Mm-hmm.
It had never been before. And some representative in the convention said, well, we're going to have the one-drop rule, that means if you got one drop of black blood, you're African American.
Mm-hmm.
And Tillman responded, if that were the case, then nobody sitting in the Constitutional Convention would be allowed into public life in South Carolina.
Right.
Which should give people pause.
Yeah. I mean, one thing you say, and I applaud every time I hear you say it, is we are a product of our history, but we're a product of all of our history.
Yes.
And South Carolina really is a melange of people, cultures, influences, and histories all brought together, and it is impossible to separate us out.
You can't do it. As our late friend Chaz Joyner talked about, the cultural mix, whether you're talking about food, music, dancing, it comes from around the world. Some people don't like to talk about the term multicultural. Well, going back to 18th century South Carolina, we were the definition of multicultural.
Right.
And still are.
Yeah.
Just remember that the next time you have she crab soup or fried anything.
Fried okra.
Fried okra.
In particular, yeah.
Yes. Yes.
So, and again, this is not a matter of, we were talking about this in relationship to South Carolina defining race in its constitution, and what Ben Tillman said. But in the broader sense, you can simply look at it, if nothing else, the culture. You are defined by the culture you grew up with, and the culture really is a rich stew.
Well, it is, and of course in 2026, now according to those demographers who keep track of things, a majority of the people now living in South Carolina were not born here.
That's an interesting demographic change. Yeah.
Yes.
Okay.
Interesting.
Well,
that's why we're one of the fastest growing states in the country.
And that's something you might not know, or maybe you do. Maybe you're someone who has moved here. I hope that if you are, you find South Carolina from A to Z and Walter Edgar's journal informative. Well, that's it for our expanded look at topics from South Carolina from A to Z. And by the way, again, you can find that wherever you get your podcasts. I would like to point out, too, if you don't do podcasts because they confuse you or whatever, go to southcarolinapublicradio.org. You can find all of that.
And Alfred, remember, we've talked about this earlier in May. If you are familiar with A to Z and there's somebody you would like us to, or something you would like us to discuss further, shoot us an email.
That's
or
right.
If you have a topic to suggest for the podcast, we will consider.
You can find links for, I think they call it audience services, on the website at southcarolinapublicradio.org. But I'll go ahead and tell you, if you want to reach me to talk about topics, I am at Alf Turner, ALFTURNER, Alf Turner at southcarolinapublicradio.org. We'll be glad to entertain any suggestions. Matter of fact, we had some suggestions just this last week I passed on to you from some folks who suggested some topics related to the 250th anniversary of the founding of this country. Walter, thank you. This has been such fun.
Hey, Alfred, I always love this. As we do the regular A's to Z recordings, I make a check and say, this is going to be on our next expanded version of South Carolina from A's to Z.
Sets it aside so we can talk about it some more. Walter Edgar's Journal is a production of South Carolina Public Radio. I'm Alfred Turner, and I produce the show, which is made possible by listener contributions to the ETV Endowment of South Carolina. Remember, the views and opinions expressed on Walter Edgar's Journal are not necessarily those of South Carolina Public Radio or its underwriters.
Many of the books discussed in Walter Edgar's Journal can be found as part of the Walter Edgar's Journal Book Nook section at all good books in Columbia, South Carolina, or may be available from your local bookstore. We'll talk again soon.